The Sultana wasn't a tragedy of bad luck, it was a ledger entry. A calculated state-sanctioned death warrant. Rated for 376 passengers. But on April 27, 1865, that number was ignored in favor of a per-head payment scheme. At Vicksburg, the priority wasn't safety, it was volume. Quartermaster Reuben Hatch saw a payday, not a transport mission. 2,400 Union soldiers, paroled from the horrors of Cahaba and Andersonville, were crammed onto a ship built for a fraction of that load. The ship's engineers identified the primary flaw. One of the 4 boilers was cracked, leaking, and compromised. They didn't replace the failing metal. They applied a thin, temporary riveted patch, a structural shortcut to beat the clock. The Sultana sat dangerously low in the flood-swollen Mississippi. The vessel was top-heavy, sluggish, and structurally strained. This was institutional negligence. Hatch accepted kickbacks, and the captain accepted the passengers. The audit began in blood. Thousands of men, still recovering from the starvation of southern prisons, were now packed onto a literal bomb. The steam pressure rose, far exceeding the integrity of the patch. The machinery wasn't just working, it was failing. The system was pushed past its failure point. By 2:00 a.m., the math was undeniable. The boilers didn't just fail, they detonated, and the river claimed what the war had left behind. At 2:00 a.m., 7 miles north of Memphis, the vessel's boilers were operating under a design pressure of 145 psi. That patch, it reduced the structural integrity of the entire system to roughly 100 psi, a fatal, calculated weakness. The disaster is officially listed as a mechanical failure. But for decades, a second theory has haunted the record: sabotage. A confession from a Confederate agent named Robert Loudon claimed a coal torpedo, an explosive disguised as fuel, was slipped into the furnace. The blast originated at the upper crown sheet, far from the firebox where a torpedo would burn. The true catalyst was careening. As the ship listed, the water shifted away from the flues, leaving the metal exposed and brittle. Without water to cool it, the iron reached a plastic state. It could no longer contain the internal pressure. The system hit that 100 psi patch limit, and the safety margin evaporated. The center boiler detonated first, shattering the hull and triggering a kinetic chain reaction in its neighbors. The wooden superstructure, coated in layers of flammable varnish, ignited instantly. It wasn't a fire, it was an incinerator. Thousands were vaulted into the freezing current. For the survivors, the war wasn't over. It had just transformed. The boiler's structural limit was breached. The explosion was the start. What followed was a logistical failure of epic proportions. The river became a vast, liquid morgue. It was record-breaking flood season. The river had breached its banks, creating a 3-mile-wide, lethal labyrinth of water. The forensic reality, a full hour of silence. For 60 minutes, thousands of men fought the current in total isolation. These weren't soldiers in their prime. These were skeletal men, recently released from death camps, with 0 caloric reserves. The engine room rupture dumped fuel into the water, a slick, suffocating barrier that was toxic to inhale and impossible to swim through. The current was relentless. It didn't just drown them, it pulled the weak into the dark, sweeping them miles downstream. The river was glacial, swollen with snowmelt. Hypothermia did not just incapacitate them, it stripped them of the will to hold on. Help only arrived after 3:00 a.m. The Bostonia II and other vessels transitioned from traders to an overwhelmed, improvised morgue. The lack of a valid manifest made identification impossible. The bureaucracy of the army had vanished. Only the dead remained. Men washed ashore in a state of advanced shock, covered in river sludge, suffering from severe agonizing steam burns. This wasn't a rescue operation, it was a salvage. and in the blackness, most of the bodies were simply lost to the silt. The river kept its tally. By dawn, the Sultana was a ghost, leaving a death count that would never be fully reconciled. Tragedy demands accountability. But in the case of the Sultana, justice was not a process. It was an exercise in evasion. A formal inquiry was convened, but the primary target, Captain J. Cass Mason, was already at the bottom of the Mississippi. The real architect of the disaster, Quartermaster Reuben Hatch, used his political connections to dodge 3 separate subpoenas. Documentation confirms the graft. Hatch brokered the transport for kickbacks, knowing the ship was a death trap. This wasn't his first corruption scandal. He had survived prior arrests for bribery solely through his brother's political leverage. The only man actually brought to trial was Captain Frederick Speed, the officer who simply managed the loading at Vicksburg. Speed was convicted of neglect, but the Judge Advocate General later reversed it, correctly noting the focus was misplaced. It was a systemic shell game. Captain George Williams, who ordered the boarding, was never even charged. The chain of blame was severed. The military protected its own West Point-trained officers, leaving the responsibility to vanish into bureaucracy. Hatch resigned and walked away. Speed was cleared. The thousands who died became a footnote in a system designed to fail. There was no justice for the dead, only a ledger that never balanced, and a government that refused to look at the math. The audit was a failure by design, and the river, as always, kept the true count. Why is the deadliest maritime disaster in U.S. history largely forgotten? Because it happened exactly when the world wasn't looking. The nation was mourning Lincoln. The news cycle was trapped in a loop of national trauma. The Sultana was simply buried by the headlines. 1,500 died on the Titanic. Roughly 1,200 to 1,800 on the Sultana. One is a global icon, the other a footnote. But the disaster forced a pivot. It was the primary driver for the Act of 1871, the first federal mandate for meaningful maritime oversight. Lifeboats, capacity limits, boiler inspections, these weren't just common sense. They were written in the blood of the men on the Sultana. The wreck? She isn't in the river anymore. The Mississippi shifted course, leaving her resting under a quiet field in Arkansas. She is physically off the map, buried beneath decades of silt, waiting for an audit that will never officially arrive. Her location is known to local researchers, but she remains undisturbed, a massive iron sarcophagus in the middle of a farm. The ghost of the Sultana isn't a spirit. It's the regulations in your life jacket and the inspection stamp on your local ferry. History is a series of corrections. We prioritize the tragedies that fit our narratives and discard the ones that challenge our institutions. The Sultana is a warning. It's a reminder that when institutional oversight fails, the cost is always calculated in human lives. A century and a half later, the final audit of the Sultana is finally complete.